So you see the title there, microphone's on. Great. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. A phrase like capturing the jazz moment is one that suggests that there's a direct connection between music as heard on recordings and as one might hear it in a live setting. That suggestion, though, threatens both to hide the creative decision-making of musicians, producers, and engineers, and to reduce the myriad processes and technologies of audio recording to a single function: capture. It likewise points toward a romantic, with a capital R, understanding of the relationships between sound, performance, and time. When I first started thinking seriously about whether capture was an appropriate, or started thinking seriously, about recording, and whether capture was an appropriate metaphor for it, I was a graduate student in, as you now know, ethnomusicology, trying to relate my study of the world's varied musical traditions to what I thought I knew about jazz, rock, R&B, and other musics I held dear. And somewhere in all the reading I was doing, I came across Walter Ong's book, Orality and Literacy. I found a lot there to think about, good and bad. As some of my fellow academics and I might put it, his writing was suggestive. But one idea in particular about the nature of sound stayed with me. He wrote, quote, "All sensation takes place in time, but sound has a special relationship to time, unlike that of other fields that register in human sensation. Sound exists only when it is going out of existence," end quote. Just that last part that was really striking. Sound exists only when it's going out of existence. And thus it was perhaps that human beings at various points throughout our history have devised a number of ways to grapple with the ephemerality of sounds, to keep them from disappearing, to make them easier to remember or to represent. So like breaking those two words up, remember, putting things back together, represent, presenting things again. And among the various forms of representation, the various ways that we've devised to keep sounds from going away, from syllables whose hard consonants and shifting vowels mimic the attacks and durations of a West African bell pattern, kong kong kele, kong kele, kong kong kele, kong kele, to graphic notations whose sound or whose relationship to sound is more symbolic. So Western notation giving you the same thing. Recording, understood as a means to capture elusive, slippery sounds before they are lost to time, promises something more direct. But what really are we hearing when we listen to recordings of jazz? How were they made? How have the people who made them understood what they were doing? And what implications do the answers to those questions have for how we might understand what we're hearing? So, for almost anyone who's ever thought about the history of recording, there's one event which seems to start audio recording, at least in the modern era, seems to get it going, and that is the invention in 1877 of the phonograph by Thomas Edison. One of the things that's interesting, at least from a historical standpoint, is that in the list of 11 possible uses that Edison imagined for the phonograph, music came after. That is, recording music came after letter writing, dictation, books for the blind or illiterate, and, quote, other educational purposes like speech pedagogy, end quote. And in the rest of the list, recording music was clearly subordinate to speech preservation. And for a number of different reasons, if you look at Edison's device, you see the acoustic horn there, and you see a cylinder on the side. The only way to make recordings with the cylinder is to get right in front of the horn, and the vibrations from your voice create energy. They make a stylus at the end of the horn vibrate, and as you turn the cylinder with the crank on the side, you record whatever sound is coming through. This means that playback is going to be heavily dependent upon, well, actually recording and playback are going to be heavily dependent upon the person operating the crank. Not necessarily the most reliable medium. And also not necessarily the kind of thing that's very amenable to mass production. You get a bunch of these things in the room, and then you've got a bunch of people who all have to crank them all at the same time. It's going to be really hard to do that. So you see tinfoil and then wax as a medium, single mechanism, variable speed playback. One attempt to get past this or to overcome those limitations came about a decade later when Emil Berliner patented the gramophone. And his device has an acoustic horn just like Edison's, but it uses a flat disc. And this is as much a technological solution he devised as it was an attempt not to run afoul of Edison's patents. So it's not simply that he thought, oh, this disc is going to be better. The disc was a way for him not to be sued by Edison. You know, the medium, again, was wax. Metal stampers would press down on the original made during a recording. You get a nice negative, and then you can use those to mass-produce recordings. And so it's really Berliner's phonograph that opens the door for the mass production of recording, even though it doesn't necessarily begin at that moment. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that both of these, you see the horns, are acoustic recording processes. They depend on people who are making a recording being there all close to the horn. Well, to give you a sense of what an acoustic recording sounds like, this is the very first jazz recording made in 1917, so it's a bit afterwards. And just pay attention to the sound quality here. By current standards, acoustic recordings might sound a bit crude. And the process of recording them and the media on which they were recorded meant that only a limited portion of the audible frequency range would be preserved, and that the musicians would have to adapt whatever their normal performance practices might have been to the limits of the medium. So they would have to position themselves around the horn, and so that would mean that if you had a very large ensemble, you probably wouldn't be making acoustic recordings. You also probably wouldn't use certain kinds of instruments that might tend to overwhelm the horn and make the needle jump off the recording medium, so no drums, at least early on in the recording process. And also because of the presentation medium, most songs were limited to about 3 minutes, 78 RPM. And so you would have to tailor your material to the limitations of the medium. Some of those limitations, at least the sonic ones, would become less problematic after 1925 with the adoption of the microphone and electrical means of sound conversion. The first people to really take advantage of the microphone were broadcasters, and only later did people who made recordings start to think about the potential of microphones. So as David Morton puts things in his book, Off the Record, the technology and culture of sound and sound recording in America, electric recording meant that, quote, instead of having performers shout into a recording horn and using sound energy to record directly, the electrical recording process converted sound into electricity in a microphone. The signal from the microphone was amplified electronically and then fed to an electromagnetic record cutter to produce a recording on a wax-coated disc. And in either event, musicians were still restricted by the medium. So even though there was better sound quality coming from microphones, there were other problems that came up for musicians. So the sensitivity of microphones, it turned out, meant that they had to adjust what they did in the studio. The rustling of sheet music, the shuffling of feet, even noisy breathing had to be curtailed. And so one writer in the Saturday Review noted that, quote, the musician can't move 6 inches from where he is standing for fear of upsetting the tonal balance. If he hums while he plays, he must stop it. And if he breathes through his nose, he must open his mouth a little so that he may avoid what can sound like a consumptive intrusion on the finished product. And one interesting side note, after the introduction of electrical recording, which mimics or which has connections to some modern debates, there were lots of people who complained about the new electrical processes, saying that the recordings were too bright and shrill, and they actually preferred the mellow warmth of acoustic recordings. We may talk a bit about that later. But one thing that came out of the electrical recording process in the 1930s was an obsession, especially among those who would become engineers, with sound measurement. Because since we can do things electrically, now we can measure everything. We're going to make instruments to make sure that we're getting the proper response from everything. And one of the things that emerged from this was the rise of a person called a balance engineer, a person who would use several microphones for a recording and adjust them during rehearsals for optimal placement, scare quotes around optimal, and whose relative loudness he would adjust before and perhaps during recording to make the final product more faithful, again in scare quotes. And one of the things also that emerged around this time, as engineers doing all their measurements realized that playback materials had certain limitations. They would electronically boost certain frequencies in the process of recording because those frequencies didn't come out so well on playback material. And so if you boost them during recording and make them exaggerated, then when they play back on inferior material, you might actually still hear those frequencies. And so at this point, equalization is a compensatory rather than a creative thing. And so in our recording timeline now, we've got the phonograph. And we add to that the microphone, and then in 1938, the acetate-coated aluminum disc. And I put the I in there just for my British friends, the aluminium disc. And one of the advantages of the aluminium disc was that it had lower surface noise than some of the things that came before, and it had a wider frequency response. So by the time we get to the end of the 1930s, going into the 1940s, the jazz moment, as it were, was being turned into electrical signals, modified via equalization, etched in real time on disc, and it could sound much more clear than ever by the end of the 1940s. And two short clips from a documentary about the engineer Tom Dowd, engineer and producer Tom Dowd, will give us a visual sense of what recording was in the late 1940s.
First time I ever was in a recording studio or a control room was in 1947. At that time, it was a different art form with regard to musicianship, the concept of recording, and the limitations of the equipment that you had to capture the performance with. The state of the art was to employ a 16-inch table with a lead screw of fixed pitch, moving a magnetically motivated pendulum-type needle across a disc, and you were cutting directly to disc. If it was about a 2.5 minute selection, you'd be cutting 88 lines per inch. If it was a 3-minute composition, you'd have to make the entire composition much softer, and instead of employing 88 lines per inch, you'd be somewhere around 112 lines per inch, which meant that the records would skip and the volume would be down. I mean, these are all things that today you don't even consider, but then it was major problems.
And they recorded pretty much with one microphone. You know, they moved everybody around and balanced the people in the room. And today we don't have those problems anymore. Today, these boards are 72 inputs, some of them. You know, I can put 72 mics up if I wanted to.
I never was an advocate of one microphone in the studio. There was such a dynamic difference between the intensity of a string bass. We didn't have amplifiers. You're playing a string bass or an acoustic guitar versus a drum. I didn't need to put a mic anywhere near the drum. He'd come in on the bass mic. So I put a mic on the bass. I put a mic on the piano. I put a mic in front of the singer. And then when I got in the control room, I would selectively increase or decrease the volume. And all of a sudden people are saying, oh, there's a bass on that record. How did he do that?
Back in those days.
So with that, we start to see engineering as a creative act rather than one concerned with simply capturing a moment. So creating a moment rather than capturing a moment. And thinking about that, might make us question how many ways recordists at the time augmented reality. We'll never really know. But there were other limits that still remained for recording. And one of these was an industry-mandated one. Because of union regulations and for a number of other different reasons, in general, when musicians went into the recording studio, they would go in for 3-hour blocks. And in those 3-hour blocks, they would be expected to record 4 sides. So 2 complete 78 RPM releases. And you think 3 hours, 4 sides, it's about 12 minutes worth of music. Why do they need so much time? Well, because it turns out getting to the moment often requires rehearsal and a lot of repetition. So if we think about, for example, the recordings made by Charlie Parker for the Savoy record label, a bit of background on how those recordings were made lets us know why they might need so much time. As James Patrick writes in the liner notes of that release, the Savoy studio procedure was simple, if somewhat hectic. Quote, Parker was allowed to select all material with the proviso that the pieces be original compositions. That is, not ones for which they'd have to pay royalties to someone else. Occasionally, Parker would prepare rough sketches for his new tunes, but more often, instructions were conveyed orally, and there were no regular lead sheets and no rehearsals. The routine for individual numbers would be verbally outlined, and the band would then record. So we're going to listen to not the finished versions of one of Parker's tunes, but 2 of the attempts to get Another Hairdo done right. So in the first take, less than 6 bars in, we're going to hear Charlie Parker cut things off. And I suspect that he was improvising bars 5 through 8 of this 12-bar progression, and he didn't like the way he started improvising in the middle section there. And so we'll hear him cut things off. So, hold it, start it once more. So, second take. They make it all the way through the blues progression once, they get through it a second time, but he misses an entrance in the 9th bar the second time out, and again, he has to stop things. So he gets it that first time. Now, and then, yeah, so hold it, it'll go down this time. It actually didn't go down the next time. It took a 4th take for them to get it right, but the 4th take was a keeper, and I suspect that they were also running out of time on the session, so they just had to stick with it. But sometimes, no amount of rehearsal will suffice for musicians to get a perfect take, and that's where the next advance in recording technology enters the story. So this is the timeline we have so far, and during the Second World War, German engineers developed procedures for recording sound onto magnetic tape. Their procedures were copied and refined in the US after the war's end, though not immediately in the way that you might expect. Basically, engineers used tape recordings as a buffer before they made acetates. So they didn't record onto tape and stop there. They recorded onto tape, and then they would put things onto acetate after that. But one of the things engineers liked about tape was that, on one hand, it was a lot less sensitive to things like temperature and humidity. They could move tape machines around, and also they could edit. So you do a bunch of different things with tapes, and then you make the acetate afterwards. So you're not wasting precious money and time on acetates when you can be using tape, which is actually a bit cheaper. So you might ask, especially given that film folks had been editing sound since the 1930s, how tape or tape editing alters the capture of a moment. I'll give you one extreme example. Brilliant Corners, the title track of Thelonious Monk's 1956 Riverside album, is probably one of his trickiest compositions. Instead of being a standard 32-bar AABA song where each section is 8 bars, it has a 23-bar ABA form. So 8 bars, 7 bars, 8 bars. And it has an added structural hurdle, regular shifts in tempo. So the next slide will take us through the opening of the tune and help you to see and hear the basic form. And for those of you who are counting, pay particular attention to the section that'll be highlighted in green. It'll be the second A section in the fast portion. And it'll show up in green on the screen. And so if you're counting along 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, pay attention. Of course, the portion in green wasn't 8 measures. And if it seemed a little strange, well, allow me to read to you from The View from Within, the memoir of Orrin Keepnews, who is the producer of the recording. He says, "This is, of course, a very celebrated session. I've written about it often over the years, and I can still feel the same sense of emotional exhaustion on listening to the recording, and a continuing feeling of surprise that we were able to issue a complete version of Brilliant Corners. The facts are quite simple. We spent a full 4 hours in the studio that night, began this piece at least 25 times, and quit without the quintet having once played it to completion. The composition is incredibly tricky. It has an off-center rhythmic pattern, and every second chorus is played at doubled tempo. The mere fact that such thorough professionals as Roach and Rollins and Pettiford were unable to satisfy Thelonious says all that need be said about the immensity of their task. In fact, late in the evening, Pettiford and the leader exchanged harsh words, leading to an amazing situation that perhaps could only have happened on this night. During one take, we in the control room were sure the bass mic was malfunctioning. Oscar was obviously playing, but not a sound could be heard. The unpleasant truth was that the bassist was actually not playing. He was merely pantomiming quite convincingly. And Keepnews adds that Pettiford and Monk never worked together again after that. But Keepnews concludes, when we finally quit, I was aware that several portions had been excitingly executed. I could only hope that the pieces could be welded together, in particular that one abruptly concluded opening chorus could be used as an ending. Although I had no experience with such drastic tape editing, it all succeeded far beyond expectations. So what exactly did Keepnews do to the example you heard a few moments ago? He spliced the beginning of a slow solo chorus from one take to the end of a fast second chorus from another take. In the process, he lengthened the piece by 2 beats of the fast tempo or 1 beat of the slow tempo, depending on how you're counting. And so, because the first one probably went by too quickly for most people to register, we're going to do this one more time. And this time we're going to do just the fast portion. And you'll see, again, the form going by on the screen. Yeah, so you all got that the second time, right? Just because I figured it might be a bit too tricky, let's do it one more time, this time watching the waveforms in a digital audio editing program so you can really see. And keep your eyes on the lower right-hand corner of the screen where you should, but it's going to be probably down there. You'll see the form going by as it plays. I think. Yeah. And I gained a great deal of appreciation for what Keep News did, because one of the things I was trying to do to show off today, and it didn't work out so well, was to actually edit it without the extra beat in there. I have some things that sound okay, but I'm not going to share them. But under the circumstances, even the staunchest purist might forgive Mr. Keep News. But what about other enhancements that might go unnoticed because they're less extreme? Indeed, preceding the editing work that he did for this Monk recording, or that Keep News did, critics had already begun complaining about the growing distance they perceived between performance and recording, between capture and creation. So if we go back to our developing history, there are a couple of other things that complicate the story a bit more. The first is the introduction of the long-playing LP, or long-playing album, or the LP, in the late 1940s. It also raised the stakes. On one hand, musicians could shed some repertory constraints. They could play things that were longer than 3 minutes. They could more readily approximate the kinds of things they might have done in live performance, at least when they weren't doing radio broadcasts. But on the other hand, they now had to come up with material that could sustain an audience's interest for more than 6 minutes at a time. And so it's in this regard that recording companies started working on other things. And one of the biggest was improving sound quality, improving the quality of recordings. The big craze for hi-fi recordings and hi-fi playback systems in the 1950s, all marketed under the term high fidelity. Engineers at Decca Records invented something called the Decca Tree, which is a configuration of microphones that they put together specifically to record classical ensembles. And recording studios still use them today. If you go to some recording studio websites, they will advertise that they've got Decca trees. And so this is it's an important thing. They also invested a lot of money in old buildings that might actually sound good for recordings. So consider what Columbia Records engineer Frank Lyko said about the record label's regular use of artificial ambience on recordings in the 1950s. And some of it starts with Mitch Miller, but it showed up on other recordings as well. So in talking about a Miles Davis session, he says, the studio that they used had its own echo, which was very nice. However, it would be a different sounding echo with each session. So he and the other engineers got together and found a way to regulate the ambience by feeding the sound from each microphone in the recording studio separately to a 12 by 15-foot concrete storage room in the basement of the building. And they put a speaker in that room while everything came through, and then a microphone to pick up the sound from the speaker, and then they would feed the sound from that microphone through the circuitry of a tape machine before mixing it in with the rest of the recording. So all those 50s recordings you've heard on Columbia that you love so much, they were all probably made this way. And in fact, when we combine that kind of observation with close listening, it might make even some of our most celebrated and prized recordings as jazz fans sound a bit less stately, or at least make us realize that there's something else going on. So take, for now, what to me seems like excessive reverberation on Miles Davis's solo at the beginning of Freddie Freeloader from the album Kinda Blue. If you go home and, if you have the recording, you go home and listen to it on headphones, it almost sounds as though Davis is playing in a different room from the rest of the band. But despite that, his engineers, the engineers at Columbia, were working at least with a notion of transparency in mind, with the idea that they want to use as many technical means as they had at their disposal to deliver a natural sounding product. And so one other thing that then gets added to the mix by the end of the 1950s and going to the 1960s is the adoption of multi-track recording on one hand, so recording all the instruments separately on tape so that they can all be edited later, and also by the early 1960s, the introduction of stereo recording, or the wide adoption of stereo recording. It had been around since the 40s, but it's only in the 60s that a lot of labels really started taking advantage of it. And with those two advances in mind, if we move a decade ahead from Davis's recording to one of Thelonious Monk's last celebrated recording dates, we might watch the following clip from the documentary Straight No Chaser in two ways. One, as an account, perhaps, of a moment uncaptured and maybe even interrupted.
Melody and the time is it already.
Let's really do one now. We're all suited.
Huh?
Let's do one.
Yeah, I mean, we're just building the piece over. Why you stop us for? Unnecessary stuff. What do we have before we so rudely interrupted? Huh? Go ahead. You finish.
take. And usually we take the first take. Sometimes we take the second, but never the third. You say once you play it the first time, that's where the feeling and everything is. And after that, it starts going downhill. So, and it's more like a challenge when you do that. You know that you got to play it correctly the first or second take, or that's it. He would take it anyhow. If you mess up, well, that's it. That's your problem. You have to hear that all the rest of your life.
Of course, Rouse's statement might certainly be true of his work with Monk, but it runs slightly counter to the narrative that I've been presenting. And it also doesn't take account of the fact that you can rehearse a song 35 times before you do 2 takes. And so maybe some spontaneity is lost in all that rehearsal, who knows. But one thing that does come out of this is that musicians have always been conscious of the constraints and opportunities of recording. And in that way, and also following on the history that we've had, I watched that clip in a way that's probably different from a lot of other people. So I'm going to take you back through that clip. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I'll show you what I see, at least given some of my current interest, when we go through that clip. So starting from the beginning, going through it, I see, in order, Charlie Rouse's microphone, far enough away for the room sound to blend in with the signal from his saxophone. Larry Gales, the bassist, enclosed by gobos or baffles, with a microphone angling between them, the separators high enough to isolate the sound of his bass from the drums, but low enough to allow him visual contact with the other musicians. A small microphone in the upper left quadrant, positioned to pick up the sound of Ben Riley's hi-hat cymbal. It's a little reddish circle. 2 further drum microphones, one overhead for the drum kit and one down below for the bass drum. And then the first and second of the microphones there to record the piano. These are all indications that, in fact, we're not just getting a performance, but that what we hear on the recording is constructed. It is, in fact, not the sound from inside the room, but the sound from the control room. So when we're playing that clip, we're not hearing the sound in the room, we're hearing the sound from the recording console. Indeed, it seems that by the end of the 1960s, we had moved about as far from capture as we might possibly have had gone. Recordings like Miles Davis's In a Silent Way, assembled from hours of jamming in the studio, perhaps deflected attention from the amount of work that generally went into making recording sound live, like products of in-the-moment performance. And it's for that reason, for example, that there are lots of people who celebrate the work of engineer Rudy Van Gelder in the 1950s and the 1960s, but there are also a lot of people who hate it because every piano on every Rudy Van Gelder record sounds the same. It could be Herbie Hancock, it could be Andrew Hill, they sound like the same piano player, according to the critics. And we can also think about the clarity, frequently glossed as icy, of recordings on the ECM label in the 1970s and the 1980s, or even the very bizarre sort of connoisseurist recordings released by a label like Maple Shade, where there are details about the microphones and the cables included with every release for people who want to know exactly how things were done. I mean, I enjoy learning that, but not everyone does. Along with the development of digital recording in the 1970s and the adoption of the compact disc medium in 1982, more recent technological changes have further increased the distance between performance and recording. It's now more common, in fact, when one enters a recording studio to see all of the musicians in separate spaces, listening to one another on headphones with their own specialized balances rather than gathered in the same room. So consider, for example, this clip from the 2010 documentary Icons Among Us, which shows the Robbie Coltrane Quartet recording under modern circumstances, making a digital, multi-track recording in a way that couldn't be further removed from what musicians, arrayed around an acoustic horn, did nearly 100 years ago.
I've been improvising a lot of compositions lately because and using those parts and sort of organizing those elements in a way that's closer to like traditional styles of writing. And then what I'm left with is something that I wouldn't have just naturally written down if it had, with the opportunity. And it's also usually something that forces the group to kind of to play it differently. You know what I mean? Because if it's an unconventional kind of tune, it's hard to show up with your bag. You know what I mean? It kind of forces you to be more creative. The greatest people that we admire today, they did more than that. They were more than just great players or great technicians or great stylists. The great ones really had this vision that kind of was much more important than how hip the last record sounded. The vision, it kind of went past all those surface level things. You know what I mean?
If anything, recording now, as in the past, isn't so much about capturing any particular moments as it is about creating them. Rather than the metaphor of a candid photograph, in fact, we might consider recordings to be more like formal family portraits. They are staged, tightly framed events, which have to look good or sound good, because they'll be around, one hopes, for a long time. Indeed, the more I've thought about these things, since reading Walter Ong and after years of sitting in studios, learning about the technologies and seeing the creative ways in which musicians, engineers, and producers have exploited them all, I'm happy to keep performance and recording separate in my mind. If anything, the two are mutually reinforcing. To make that point, I'll close with a clip of the Brian Blade Fellowship at the 2008 JVC Newport Jazz Festival. This is also taken from the Icons Among Us documentary, and it features one of my colleagues at the University of Chicago, the saxophonist Melvin Butler. So. Right, well, I seem to be missing that clip. We may get to it in a minute, but I'll tell you what I was going to say about it. Performances like that one can be magical. and it really was, and hopefully I'll get to play it in a moment. But recordings can be too. And what really are we hearing when we listen to recordings of jazz? What implications does that answer for how we might does that answer have for how we might understand what we hear? The work of musicians, engineers over the years hasn't been focused on capturing moments because moments don't reliably and regularly appear. But if they can be constructed, like a masterfully edited film or a brilliantly paced novel, why should anyone complain that they aren't real, that they aren't captured moments? Why can't we regard artistry, even in a performance, recording artistry, even in a performance in a tradition like jazz, as complementary rather than degrading? So performance, recording, they're separate things. And as strong as our desire might be to capture something, recordists of various kinds have realized that it might be better simply to create something. Thank you. All right, questions though. Yes, sir.
Hey, we'll bring a mic to you.
Oh, I'm sorry. At some lectures I heard at New Trier High School on jazz, and they do it on a regular basis, they talk about the fact that everybody in the band ends up with a different beat. You're supposed to start at a certain point, everybody's supposed to end at a certain point, and not every musician does. How do they compensate for that? I suppose in the online studio, in the lab, they can take care of that?
Can you explain?
In other words, everybody's supposed to start at the same beat.
Right.
They're supposed to end at the same beat.
Mm-hmm.
And they said they don't. Because not everybody is physically able to count like everybody else. So how do they do that?
I'll tell you really briefly about a long-standing disagreement I had with a musician friend of mine. We had been playing one particular song together for quite some time and didn't realize that we had completely different conceptions of where one was, basically, where the first beat of the measure was. And it turns out it didn't really matter because we actually played together in such a way, even though he was wrong about where one was, we nonetheless could do a creditable performance together. And so as long as as long as everyone compensates so that they are playing in sync with one another, then that's pretty much the thing that matters. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on. I mean, you said they're kind of these complementary, recording and live music, but do you feel that recording can actually have a negative effect on live music? For instance, I can't listen to Naima any other way than the way that it is on the recording, and I actually feel like I don't listen to a lot of modern jazz or even modern jazz recordings because I'm so ingrained and used to the way they sounded in the 50s. It's become kind of a nostalgic sound, like the audio, the physical quality of the sound. And I guess also as like a two-parter, are there jazz artists today who are trying to replicate those old methods of recording? I know that's very popular in like a lot of indie music, kind of getting that lo-fi sound or something like that. Are examples of that in modern jazz?
Yeah, so two quick answers. There's a great book which has been out of print for a long time called On Becoming a Rock Musician by the sociologist H. Stith Bennett. And one of the things he spends a lot of time talking about in that book is a notion of recording consciousness. So what happens when you have a generation of people whose ideas about music making are formed primarily based on what they've heard on records? And it turns out what you have then are people who make sounds that mimic the kinds of things they heard on records. Not necessarily a bad thing. It turns out that early in the 20th century even, you could note, and Mark Katz does this in a book called Capturing Sound, you could note changes in the vibrato of classical violin players based on the transition from live performance to listening to recordings. And so it's not so much that it's a bad thing or a good thing, it's just something that happens. That we are products of our time and of our times, and we respond to and make music based on those things. And so there are lots of people who, like you, probably are so stuck on the sound of those recordings that, for example, when compact discs were introduced in the 1980s, lots of people complained about the sound of compact discs. And it turns out there were people who were doing bad transfers, and that's one problem. But the thing that many people were nostalgic for on vinyl recordings, it turns out, is a particular kind of distortion introduced by the process of recording and by the medium. And so once that distortion was gone, it became apparent to a lot of people that, actually we kind of like that distortion. It did something for us. And there are musicians, though, who today, and I'm thinking in particular about the trumpeter Terence Blanchard, who at various points has told engineers who wanted to put everybody in isolation booths, no, put the bass player behind some baffles, but we all want to be in the same room. And there are even more extreme examples, like a producer named Mark Levinson, who produced Jackie Terrason's 1993-1994 album Reach, where all the musicians were playing in the same room. He was in the room with them, and no headphones, no editing, And so there are people who try to do that, but now it pretty much registers as a gimmick. Over here. Yeah, so the question was about compression, and what compression means in this case is something that's been happening increasingly with commercial recordings and a lot major label commercial recordings over the last 10 or 15 years. Dynamic range compression, where if you've ever had that experience of watching a television program and then a commercial comes on and the commercial seems horrendously louder than the program material you were watching, that's a result of compression. Where you take the entire dynamic range, let's say this is the softest sound and this is the loudest sound, and you change the dynamic range so that you've got things like this. And so if this is still the range, you compress the entire dynamic range like this, and then you move everything up. So the soft sounds become louder and the loud sounds become louder. And this has been happening with a lot of recordings over the last decade or so. And one problem with it is that can lead to fatigue for listeners, because we don't actually get the nice variations between soft sounds and loud sounds that actually make it easier for us to listen. It's sort of like, the person who writes to you in all caps, or someone who shouts all the time. That gets really tedious. And compression has the potential to do that, but so many people believe that their songs aren't going to stand out on the radio or their commercials aren't going to, get people's attention unless they compress them, to death. And so from an audio standpoint and an engineering standpoint, I think it's a horrible thing. And there's also MP3 and, and those other things, but those are also, I won't say much more except to say that it's always seemed a bit odd to me, or it seemed odd to me over the last 15 years or so, that as we seem to want ever more refined visual experiences, so high-definition televisions, Blu-ray, DVD, Blu-ray recorders, we seem to be going in the opposite direction with sound. That if it sounds like someone's inside a garbage can, even though that wasn't the intent, it's okay. And I'm not quite sure what that says or what it means. It's an observation.
So you talked about changes in recording technology and producers that had impact in areas wider than jazz. So can you talk to the way that listeners might have experienced the intermediary of a producer differently in jazz than in other genres at the same time?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Jazz producers, for the most part, I think jazz producers have worked very much like their counterparts in other fields. Up until the end of the 1960s, most people didn't know who produced jazz recordings. They didn't know who engineers were. A few people like Rudy Van Gelder would be names that the knowledgeable people might know or pass about. And it's only maybe in the last couple of decades, again, that some producers have made names for themselves as celebrities in the jazz world, to the degree that one can be a celebrity in the jazz world. But in many cases, they do that primarily by cutting their teeth, making jazz recordings, getting the interest of adventurous pop music performers who then use them on other projects. And so the cult of the producer doesn't work so well in the jazz world. It never has. I mean, outside someone like, say, Craig Street, who's famous for the work he did on Cassandra Wilson albums in the early 1990s. There are not a lot of jazz producers who are very well known. There are lots of jazz engineers whom all the musicians really, really love. So there's a studio in Brooklyn in the most out-of-the-way, godforsaken seeming place called Systems 2, run by Joe and Mike Marciano. Wonderful place. So many jazz recordings have been made there over the last two and a half decades. Jim Anderson, who works at NYU now, when he's not making recordings, is also really celebrated as a jazz engineer. But that kind of career building doesn't really circulate very much outside. Not in the way, for example, that someone like Daniel Lanois could be a big producer, working in a lot of different areas. So jazz producers haven't had that much impact outside.
We have time. We have time for one more question in the center there.
I just have one quick question, and I don't know if it relates to what you're talking about compression, but when you see an older CD that then says it's remastered, what does that mean if it's remastered? What's the process of that?
Okay, so if we go back to the thing we were laying out before, something happens when we're in the studio. And multiple microphones, one microphone, all those things get recorded onto some medium, tape, acetate, whatever. Then that has to be mixed. So second stage, everything has to be mixed. Everyone has to make sure the balances are right. And then we get what engineers typically call a pre-master. So that's the thing, if someone discovers something in a vault somewhere, we found this John Coltrane recording that no one has known about for 40 years, what they find is the pre-master. And mastering is something that even most musicians and engineers don't understand very well. But mastering is the point at which you take whatever has been mixed and you equalize it. You iron out the lumps. You make sure everything sounds the right way before you release the thing that is going to be manufactured. And so when a recording gets remastered, they take that original material, whatever it is, and then they run it through whatever processes they need to, dealing with dropouts in tape, dealing with places where something's too loud or where a splice might be too obvious. They fix those things. And I'm not kidding when I say that a lot of musicians and engineers regard mastering engineers as somewhat magical people. Because even the best engineer who does what he believes or what she believes are the most amazing mixes, nonetheless will hear those mixes come back to them from a mastering engineer and realize how many mistakes they made, but not realize how they could actually rectify those things. And mastering studios, if you ever get a chance to go in a mastering studio, it's almost like going to NASA, you know? So, you know, they have all these specialized tools and knobs and dials and you know, if you think about engineering, mastering is one of these things where, you know, you've got one of the best facilities in New York right now, heavily touted in Mix Magazine, is one that has 4 floating mastering suites. And they say floating because they're in Manhattan, inside a building in Manhattan. And the rooms are completely isolated from every possible vibration that might come from outside. So if the subway rumbles underneath the building, the mastering engineer would never know. Well, I don't know. If something catastrophic were to happen that didn't destroy the building, the mastering engineer would never know. But they need that kind of precision in order to do the work they do. So anyway, thank you so much for coming out this afternoon.